Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Well, Steve, we have a very important topic we're going to review today. I know good and well throughout the Southeast and the East, people are likely tired of hearing about chronic wasting disease. And I think you and I are tired of talking about it too. We wish we weren't dealing with this.
Yeah, it's one of those topics that you hate to have to be talking about, but it's important that people have access to reliable, accurate information instead of just listening to people opinionize and oftentimes with an agenda on social media. Yeah,
that's exactly right. So Mississippi State, along with the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, a while back we hosted I think we had 5 states represented. We called it a CWD Roundtable, but it was a chance for state agency people and some university people to get together and brainstorm and talk about what has been going on and what is going on. And we capitalized on that, and we recorded 2 podcasts. Today, we're going to have more of the Midwestern story. So we're going to have Bryan Richards from Wisconsin and Paul Shelton from Illinois.
Yeah, and Bryan, he's kind of a research guy, so he's up on what everybody is doing nationally. He actually works for the federal government, so he has access to what everybody is doing across the country in research. And then Paul is he's in the trenches, deer coordinator for the state of Illinois, and he's been dealing with CWD as a management issue for almost 20 years now. So 2 great intellectuals that know their stuff are not dealing with an agenda. They're just talking about what they know and what has been learned.
Yeah, and their experience. So yes. like you say, they've been dealing with this for about 20 years, and so we thought it would be really good to catch them, that we could learn from their experience, their insight, and hopefully steer us in the right direction here down south with this new era that we're in. So Steve and I just wanted to have a little note before we got going that we know people get tired of hearing about chronic wasting disease, but we really invite you to listen in. It's really a treat for us to have these guys available and learn from their experience.
Yeah, and again, it's important to be informed. Whether or not you believe chronic wasting disease is the beginning of the end, or it's not, the sky isn't falling, and that's been part of our mantra, is we just need to understand it and learn about it. And these guys can help us understand and learn about it and see how we can live with chronic wasting disease without losing the opportunity for our beloved institution of recreational hunting. Welcome back, everyone. Steve Damaris here,
and Bronson Strickland here. Yeah.
And we have a really valuable, important episode to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about chronic wasting disease, which we've talked about in the past from the standpoint of how we felt when we had our first case, and we had a follow-up episode talking more about chronic wasting disease, and we're here in Starkville at the Mississippi Chronic Wasting Disease Roundtable meeting that has been organized by the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. And we have some nationally renowned speakers here trying to help the southeastern state agencies and the forestry and all the natural resource agencies. We're collected here. We've got 31 different agencies from over 10 states, and it's just really been a great day. And we've got 2 of our guest speakers here to talk more about their expertise, and they are really, I mean, you and I talk about it, and we've learned a lot about it over the last 2 years, but we read stuff and learn about it. These are the guys that are writing and learning about the stuff. So we're happy.
These are the guys we listen to and then we talk about it.
Yes.
This is who we get our information from.
Exactly. So we have Dr. Bryan Richards, who's an emerging disease coordinator at the USGS, which stands for United States Geologic Service.
Geological Survey.
National Wildlife Disease Lab in Wisconsin.
Yep. National Wildlife Health Center up in Madison, Wisconsin.
So you're like a wildlife disease specialist.
So I'm just a good old-fashioned wildlife biologist who grew up studying deer and reading everything about deer. And, I grew up and was raised in Wisconsin. And so in 2002, at that point in time, I worked with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And so, we got the call just like everybody else did. CWD showed up 900 miles east of where it had been before and on the other side of what we thought was a pretty substantial barrier, being the Mississippi River. And so for me, it had dual impact. One, I was involved with, developing surveillance plans and monitoring deer imports and things for the state of Texas. But now we got the word that, CWD had been detected literally a stone's throw from where I grew up. And that one was felt.
Yeah, it got personal.
Yeah, it really did.
And we also have Dr. Paul Shelton, who is Forest Game Coordinator with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And Paul, we're really excited and thank you for joining us too. You've been involved in CWD work at the state agency level for quite a few years now. How many years?
Well, we found CWD in Illinois in the fall of 2002. So just really a few short months after it was announced in Wisconsin. We had geared up. Prior to that, we were starting our big surveillance efforts, and so given the distribution of where it was in Wisconsin, we immediately kind of stacked our odds, and we were looking really heavily up at the border there, and sure enough, we found it right away. It was took a little while to recover from it, but we have now been battling with chronic wasting disease for 17, 18 years in Illinois, and I think that we've been able to demonstrate that there are some things that can be learned about it. There are some positive steps that you can take, and it doesn't have to be a prevalence is going to continue to climb all the time type of battle. That there are some things that can be done.
Yeah, Illinois is just a shining example out there of intestinal fortitude, just keeping going when against all odds, putting together a strong management plan from square one, standing up for your principles and just never saying stop. And I think the results are, it's pretty clear. They're making a difference with CWD on the ground today.
Fantastic.
There's a lot of places that came before us, and we were able to look and see some missteps that have been made. And we wanted Illinois citizens and hunters to know that we were going to be upfront with them, and that we were going to tell them everything that we knew, and if we didn't know something, we would let them know that as well. And so we've tried to keep the lines of communication open, because it's only with the support of the citizenry, the hunters, and your General Assembly that you're going to be able to continue to do this sort of management program.
Mm-hmm. Why, Bronson and I have talked about why it's important to worry about CWD. What are y'all's?
What's the big deal? Why should hunters be concerned?
Well, before Bryan gets into his reasons, and he has some very good reasons, but I often hear, it's not a human health risk. It doesn't do this. It doesn't do that. But it's like, throughout most of North America, and certainly in Illinois, one of our most prized natural resources is the white-tailed deer. And, it's a majestic animal. I got into deer management simply because I loved deer. I was a deer hunter, and and I could think of nothing that I'd rather devote my life to. And to think that people question why, if it's not a human health risk. Well, the deer resource is such a precious thing by itself that, if it's in peril, isn't that worth being concerned about? Does it have to be for any other reason? Just deer by themselves are worth being concerned about it.
Well, someone being a deer nut like myself, that is certainly good enough for me. Absolutely.
And then we can add on top of that. So in addition to being that cherished natural resource, look at the economic, viability and the economic resources provided by deer. And so I live in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is one of those states that deer, you put all the economic multipliers, and it's about a $1.3 billion per year economic generator for the state of Wisconsin. A lot of people spend a lot of money to go hunt deer in Wisconsin. There's that trickle down to the mom and pop shops and the little motels in the northern part of the state, that there's many of those would go away if it wasn't for deer. So we, in state after state, I think Texas would say deer is $1 billion entity. I don't know how big it is in Mississippi, but it's got a lot of numbers in it. It's $1 billion industry. So it's real interesting. One of the things we see in Wisconsin is that the state has been able to track expenses, and so you've spent $40-50 million over the course of 15, almost 20 years. Most of that for testing, for monitoring disease, and you go into some sportsmen's clubs or places like that, and you say, yeah, spent $50 million. Their heads are just shaking. It's just horrible. It's crazy. Why are you spending that much money? So I usually try and ask the question, do you have any other resource out there that provides that level of economic benefit that you have to invest so very little in? Deer really are, we heard today, kind of the golden goose, or goose that laid the golden egg. And I think it's, same thing. It's just that gift horse that just keeps on giving. And yet there's a reluctance for agencies to spend real capital, to invest in the long-term viability of that resource. Pretty interesting.
So y'all have made the point that deer are important, and that's why we should care about it. But depending upon who you listen to on the internet, CWD is not something we need to worry about. So why? What proof do we have? Can you share that it matters?
Sure, I can take a stab at that. So if we look at characteristics of CWD, I could kind of boil it down into three big characteristics that we've observed. One is pretty dramatic geographic spread. It's been picked up in 26 of our 50 states, 3 Canadian provinces, in overseas South Korea, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Pretty substantial geographic footprint. That there's clear evidence that footprint has changed over time. So that's number one. Number two, where disease is established in free-ranging populations for a long period of time, we see prevalence, or the proportion of animals affected with this disease, increasing. We've now got numerous locations where in adult males, if you go hunting out there and you kill a 3.5, 4.5-year-old deer, literally you take a quarter out of your pocket and flip it up in the air, and that's the odds that deer has CWD. So tremendous penetrance. Then we get into the population impacts, and impacts to overall herd productivity. So at the very least, when prevalence gets higher up, it's going to be, it's going to reduce your harvestable surplus. And in some instances, when disease levels gets high enough, it's actually going to be able to drive population decline. So you put those together, geographic spread, rampant geographic spread, increases in prevalence, and impacts at the herd level. And so people regularly say, hey, it's no big deal. So I come back and I ask that question, can you name any disease of humans or domestic livestock that's spreading, growing, impacting at the population level? And you just go, that's no big deal. I'm still waiting. for that other example. But yeah, we hear that with CWD.
Bryan, could you give people an example when you say impact at the population level? What does that mean? Maybe some of the studies that have been done showing some population declines.
Sure. There's a few good studies published in the western states, and granted, these are lower productivity systems, western species. So Dave Edmonds, University of Wyoming study documented that in a specific white-tailed deer herd with high prevalence of CWD, they measure a metric defined as lambda, and it's population performance. So a lambda of 1.0 represents a stationary population. A lambda of 0.5 represents a 50% population decline per year, and 1.5 would be 50% growth per year. So after his work in this area, they find that lambda was at about 0.90, so representing a 10% decline in that population per year, attributable to chronic wasting disease. So clearly driving the train downhill. A couple of years later, we were involved with a study with Dr. Malia DeVivo in mule deer in the same geographic area. Again, really high prevalence, across the herd. I think it was in the 30th percentile. And she was able to document lambda in this herd at 0.79, representing a 21% population decline per year, again, attributable to CWD. And so it's really, both these studies were really interesting, and it's hard to tease out impacts if you're looking at a diseased area and a healthy area that are separated, by space. In these high prevalence areas, we kind of have a luxury where you're able to look at the positive segment and the negative segment of the same herd in the same area at the same time. It allows you to eliminate a lot of the other cofactors that would be very, very challenging to measure, because area A is not necessarily like area B. But when you're measuring both the positive and the negative in the same area at the same time, then you can really tease apart what is disease doing. See, now back in Wisconsin, Dr. Dan Storm and others at Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources are in essence duplicating some of this work in southwestern Wisconsin in one of these real high prevalence areas. Because the question remains, we've seen these population impacts in the West, lower productivity systems. What's going to happen in the East in a high density, high productivity white-tailed deer herd? Will CWD get to a level where it's truly driving the population? Early indications coming back. It's a 5-year study. It's got several years to go. But it's kind of interesting. It parallels one of the things we saw in Wyoming, where annual survival is truly impacted. In Wyoming, we saw that CWD negative deer had an annual survival rate of around 75%. So a quarter of them die, 3/4 of them live. In the CWD positive segment of that mule deer herd, annual survival was in the lower 30th percentile. So, disease really does impact your lifespan. If you get CWD, it's a death sentence, right? So now the first couple years from the study in Wisconsin is nearly paralleling that, showing that again, if you're CWD negative, you have a 3 in 4 chance of being alive a year from today. But if you're CWD positive, your chances of being alive 1 year later are down in the mid-30 percentile. So CWD is, if it's a killing deer, it predisposes them to every other source of mortality out there. After all, it's progressive neurological degeneration followed by death. And quite often, death is going to be what kills deer anyway. The difference is it kills them much earlier in life than they otherwise would. And when you get prevalence high enough in your female segment, you're going to start to, expect declines because you're losing reproductive output, lifetime reproductive output from your female segment.
I think I think that the biggest problem that there is to overcome is why it's this very insidious, deadly disease. It builds on itself, gets higher prevalence rates over time, and you have these increased mortality rates as a function of it. But compared to diseases which are, more frequently observed by deer hunters, like hemorrhagic disease or something like that, chronic wasting disease mortality is asynchronous, and so you don't have this large, fast-moving outbreak and a lot of deer dying at the same time, readily observable, particularly around water sources, that sort of thing that you see with hemorrhagic disease. You have this slow-moving disease where deer are dying by themselves in small numbers here and small numbers there, but it's always occurring.
It's insidious.
And so because of that, it's going undocumented by most who are not equipped to see what's going on. And because of that, you have a tendency to write it off. Well, I'm not seeing that, so it's not happening.
Another real big difference, you mentioned EHD. There's a clear end to the EHD. When you get a hard enough frost to kill all the midges, you end that disease cycle. With CWD, we have yet to identify any ecological factor that signals the end of an epizootic. They just keep building, keep on going. So huge differences.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that I have heard on social media. These are people that aren't biologists, but they're hunting experts or they're a hunting influencer. And I will hear these people say that I think is addressing that issue of they're not witnessing a mass mortality event where there's hundreds of carcasses, on the landscape at any one given time. And they'll often ask people, where are all the carcasses? Where are all these deer dying? I just don't see them. I see far more deer on the side of the road hit by a car than by this mysterious chronic wasting disease. So I think that's a really good point to drive home, is that it's a lot slower. You don't have these mass events and mass carcasses, and it's an annual and even a decade level response versus the EHD where it's a seasonal response and it's over.
Well, and also, I think probably the more rural the landscape, the less likely they are to be detected. One of the things that we see around the Rockford area, where you have many more people, much more residential development, where this outbreak was initially focused, was that people were seeing them. It wasn't the hunting community that were reporting them, but it was, the number one definition of a clinical suspect around the Rockford area is the deer that's got his nose pressed up against your window, is on your porch, is hanging around your house for days on end, shows absolutely no fear. You go outside and there it is bedded down on the patio. That's a CWD deer. Mm-hmm. And so in those areas where we had many more people, they tended to observe them. The more isolated, the more rural the areas, the less likely those sorts of observations are to happen. What are the odds that the first one in Mississippi would be observed by, a guy in a stand?
Right,
yeah.
Right. But that's the way it happened.
Literally fell over dead on the side of a food plot.
Yeah, and then you got to think, and I remember talking to William McKinley early on. It's if you watch that deer die, he's been clinical for a while. He's had disease for a long time, probably closing in on 2 years, if not a little bit longer than that. That deer's been actively shedding infectious agent out into the environment and actively transmitting CWD for the bulk of that time frame. So, when you find that first one and it's a clinical animal, it's not a good sign.
Yeah.
Well, another thing to keep in mind about the hemorrhagic disease, Paul, great point. Excuse me. With hemorrhagic disease, you have this disease mortality event, but you also, the animals that survive, and a great percentage of them get it and survive, they develop an immunity. So you've increased the herd immunity to that disease for follow-up infections. So, that's a really benefit, of a viral disease. If you survive it, you typically are immune to subsequent infections. There's no immunity with chronic wasting disease.
That's right.
No opportunity to develop it because, you get exposed to it, you get it, you die. And so,
Period.
yeah, that's end of story. And so,
well,
you know,
we look at the mechanism involved. So every disease-associated prion protein that's in a TSE positive animal, including a CWD positive animal, began as a normal cellular prion protein. So the absolute string of amino acids is identical. The body does not recognize this tertiary, this morphological change between the healthy and the disease-associated prion protein. We think about a disease like Kuru in humans, where the incubation period is measured in years, decades, up to multiple decades. And so with any other infectious agent, the body has ample time to recognize this foreign body and to mount an immune response. But when the body does not recognize the pathogen as a foreign body, there's no immune response.
Yeah, back to the prions or prions. They are a normal protein, and they're just misfolded. I think we've referred to it as a misfolded protein. And so that's why you're saying that it's not recognized as a foreign body. It's the same protein, it's just shaped a little different.
Just shaped differently, but still the same sequence of amino acids, a different tertiary shape to it. Yeah, but otherwise it's the same thing, but with radically different properties.
Can we move into what you guys are doing about it? It's been in your neck of the woods, so to speak, for right at 2 decades. It's been in our neck of the woods for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's correct that.
Okay.
We've known about
We've
it
known
in your
about
neck
it.
of the woods for about 2 years.
Good correction.
So if you take a look at the outbreak that you have jointly with Tennessee, and you look at that, I think it's pretty easy to come to the conclusion that was there for a protracted period of time and was missed by surveillance. So I hate to correct you.
That's quite all right. Steve does it all the time.
well, in Illinois, when we first found it, we knew right away that we wanted to act, and we looked at our available options, and we immediately took some steps. We didn't have the AFWA best management practices available to us. We could only look at the trials and tribulations of other places that had found it there. And so we first set out to gather as much information as we could on the landscape about its distribution to try to make sure that we had enough samples. And we wanted to involve hunters, because hunters are our most important resource when it comes to surveillance and management. And without our ability to sample hunters' harvested deer, we would know virtually nothing about distribution. And so we began a big surveillance project, and our interest was in getting data that was a large enough data set where we could know where it was on the landscape and how it changed over time, because we knew that this was not going to be a 1 or 2 year thing, that we were going to have to be in it for a while. And we initially set out to try to increase our hunter harvest, because there's all these discussions there about whether this disease is density dependent or frequency dependent, that sort of thing. And I think that in the early stages it's probably more density dependent, and as it becomes more entrenched and you have more environmental contamination, then other things come into play, and it's a more complex picture. But we felt like we needed to try to lower our densities, particularly in those areas where we knew we had CWD, and we wanted to involve the hunters in that as well. So we got very liberal on our quotas. All gun seasons in Illinois are quota seasons, but for all practical purposes, they became non-limited. You could get as many permits as you wanted. We didn't really have quotas in effect. We we gave them new seasons, a special CWD season, in an effort to increase our harvest. And there had been some concerns, particularly on the Wisconsin side, as to whether or not hunter participation would drop off after the finding of this disease. Ours did not drop off, but we were unable to achieve much of a significant increase in harvest levels. And we felt that more was going to have to happen. And so we began a program where we supplemented our hunter harvest with some sharpshooting after the season. And the reason why we did that was because it allowed us to be very precise about where we were taking deer. And we felt like that we could engender much more change by dealing with CWD on a very localized level rather than dealing with it across entire counties or management units. And in order to do that, we needed very good surveillance data. And so we re-implemented mandatory check stations. The rest of the state has electronic automated harvest reporting systems, and to allow us to interact with the hunters and check in their deer and take samples from them, and have had very good cooperation in that regard. And it gives us a very large number of samples in a very short period of time. And so based on the collections that we do, and we get deer to test from a number of other sources, but based on that, we're able to track at a very fine scale where we have CWD, where it's worse, and then we can relate that to what our densities are as far as deer populations, and kind of prioritize our areas where we need to work. And by working after the hunting seasons are over and removing a number of deer from specific spots, we've been able to see that this does have the ability on the local level to change prevalence rates. And that within those specific areas where we're working, we can actually lower those localized prevalences. And I think the biggest advantage, and possibly our biggest public relations failure, has been not just us, but other programs that have tried sharpshooting. And sharpshooting has such a negative connotation among hunters, many hunters. Although there are also many who have been open-minded and have looked at what we're trying to accomplish and been supportive. But it's a very controversial issue. But I think we've kind of missed the opportunity to explain to hunters that by targeting very small specific areas, that keeps us from having to reduce deer populations throughout entire management units. And we can leave those deer there and just remove the very high risk deer from those areas where we know CWD is. And in doing so, prevalence rates for the entire management unit are controlled, and at much less cost than if we tried to just across the board lower deer densities. And I think that's the one thing we need to try to get the word out. I realize that it's always going to be a controversial issue, and I realize that it's not always appropriate for all circumstances. But for areas where you have discrete locations of CWD, particularly in the early stages of any state's outbreak, that is your real opportunity to try to use it to try to address CWD on a local scale.
I think that reflects the guidance that's out there that is regularly given, and it involves pretty good level of surveillance. If you expect to find this disease early, you're going to have to look hard for it. And once you find it, you'll have very limited opportunity to react. And in the absence of aggressive intervention, like Illinois has done, we've seen the outcomes. We've seen alternative outcomes, and we've seen numerous of those alternative outcomes. So it's pretty predictable what happens if you don't find it early and if you don't mount an aggressive response.
Paul, you mentioned hunters having problems with sharpshooting. Why is that?
Well, deer hunting is so much more than a hobby. It's it's a lifestyle. It's you know, for many deer hunters, it's the most important thing to them, and you can't separate that from your identity. And so because of that, you know, you have to. Hunters are, you know, they're conservationists, and they share a concern for the resource, but you know, it's difficult to separate the impacts on you from the impacts on the resource. You know, never in my wildest dreams when I became a deer biologist did I ever envision a point when I would be thinking it was necessary to reduce localized specific deer populations by sharpshooting. That is never something that I wanted to do. It's not something that we enjoy doing. I think some folks have the idea that we're having a grand old time out there doing this. You know, our guys have to go out every night. It doesn't matter what the temperature is. It doesn't matter how long they've been doing it. They put in a long day out there, and they're away from we detail guys from all across the state up to this area. They have to work for a minimum number of weeks every season, and they're away from their families. And you know, the first time or two you go out, you're thinking, well, this is not so bad, but it is very draining to do it day in, day out, as I have for, you know, 18 years now. There is no joy in doing this job when it comes to culling. It's just, you know, it's sometimes we have to make difficult decisions that we wouldn't want to do, and this is something we're doing for the deer resource and for no other reason. I've had staff who have left their jobs because they just didn't want to do this anymore, and I empathize with that. It's a very difficult thing to do, and it's certainly not the thing you dreamed about doing when you studied to be a biologist.
But you know, it absolutely fits disease management principles. Identifying that segment of the population most likely to be affected, and you apply the medicine to those, as opposed to trying to apply the medicine broadly across the whole population. You can be much more effective. And all the, you know, the landscape in northern Illinois, the data you've been able to collect, you know, really it facilitates you to be effective. Like started with, you know, you guys have kept going after it. Yeah, there's no fun in being out there killing deer every night, I guarantee you.
I can remember one of the first few years I was asked at a public meeting by an academic, actually, who was thinking through the whole process, and his question was, "What's your exit strategy?" And it's like, I had no exit strategy. I still do not have an exit strategy, because it's kind of like one of the talks today. They were the indecision about, well, how many deer do you want to kill? You know, those sorts of things. We always had a response to that. Our response was, we are going to let this disease determine that in its response. So we're going to kill deer and keep looking to see how the disease is responding as we kill deer. And that's going to determine how far we have to go. Mm-hmm. And so we weren't looking for an exit strategy. We were looking for, you know, some indications of whether we were progressing in the right direction. We always wanted to have an adaptive approach and to measure whether we were doing any good. And I believe we've been able to demonstrate that we are. And so because of that, there's really nothing that I can see at this point that would trigger us wanting to stop. That's really more of a political decision as to, you know, as to whether this resource is important enough to us that we're going to keep doing everything we can to protect it. You know, there may be circumstances under which we can no longer be as effective as we once were, because as it continues to spread, we only have so much money, we only have so many people, and so, there may come a time when we begin to feel we're not having the effectiveness we need to, but we certainly haven't reached that point yet, and I don't think anybody's looking for a way out because I think it's been relatively clear that we are doing good right now.
Well, I'm going to try to compare apples and apples as much as I can, but I know Illinois and Wisconsin, different states, but when we look at the data broadly, and it varies within a state, a little bit, but essentially for the past 17 years or so, the prevalence rate has pretty much stayed around 1%, give or take.
Yes.
And for Bryan, about 5 years into that, following 2002, Wisconsin was also about 1%. And then we see it start creeping up in 2007, 8, 9, et cetera, creeping up. And then now we see data where in some locations the adult buck prevalence rate is around 55 to 60%.
Yeah, coin flip.
So you kind of started off at the same place, adjacent states, and even northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, and we just see completely two different trajectories. Can you kind of speak on what happened there with Wisconsin?
I can try. First, let me throw a caveat out there. I'm with a federal agency. It's based on science. We don't do management. I don't work for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, so I've been privy to a lot that's gone on, but it's not my management agency. But like I said, I do have this. I grew up there, and it's personal for me as well. So I'll start a little bit when you say kind of apples and apples. I'm not sure that the core area where Paul has dealt with CWD and the core area in Wisconsin, which 30-40 miles due west of Madison, when you look at the landscape composition, there's some pretty significant differences. Where Paul's is kind of an island biogeography landscape of little islands of habitat surrounded by corn forests, that go down once a year. In 30-40 miles west of Madison, we really are in much more of a wooded type situation where a much higher proportion of the landscape is in deciduous woods, and there's a lot more connectivity. So it's not quite apples to apples, that landscape, but difference I think does play a little bit of different role.
Although we do see a little bit of that in our
Yep.
western area.
No
You get to
doubt.
the unglaciated Joe Davis County area. That's much more what you would think of as deer country.
Yeah.
Much more forestry, many more deer.
Mm-hmm.
Probably another difference, I would argue, although it's hard to prove, that CWD had likely been in that zone west of Madison a little bit longer than it had been in Paul's area, which is hard to explain because clearly it was in Illinois first and it came to Wisconsin. But anyway, so CWD was detected there in 2002. And their state wildlife vet at the time, Dr. Julie Langenberg, had kicked off some pretty aggressive surveillance, and it was in response to detection and description of what happened at an elk facility in the state of Colorado. I think it was Elk Echo. And so they found CWD there and then started doing trace forwards. Where had elk gone from this facility? As I recall, I think they'd gone to like 15, 16 different states. Some of them had gone to Wisconsin. Dr. Langenberg was following this stuff and decided, hey, we really need to be doing some more surveillance. And started a very modest surveillance program, and in 2002, it was pursuant to the 2001 hunting season, 3 positives were found right on the border between Dane County and Iowa County, Wisconsin. And so Wisconsin reacted. It was the first time it was found east of the Mississippi River. How in the world did it get here? And so the idea was to go out, measure this, intensively measure this, and with a very initial attempt to try and get ahead of this disease. The whole idea was to eliminate disease, CWD from the state of Wisconsin. A laudable goal. I mean, an incredible goal, and I don't think anybody would argue that there was anything inappropriate of the goal of attempting to eliminate disease from the state, from that population. Now, as in 2002, the state of Wisconsin looked at 40,000 samples statewide. A lot of them concentrated around where those positives were, but looked at 40,000 animals statewide. Found, I think it was about 200 positives. So that was kind of a shock in that, well, hold on, there's a big difference between finding 3 and then going and doing kind of your big kickoff round of surveillance and finding 200. So it was bigger and it was badder than the state of Wisconsin thought to start with. So that didn't help. But Wisconsin mounted a very aggressive intervention, brought in experts, from Colorado, an expert to give some guidance. Basically threw every tool in the kitchen sink and found some things out back to throw at, that disease issue as well. And some of those were really unpopular, including, that horrible sharpshooting stuff. Even worse, earn a buck. Oh my God, we're going to have to shoot a doe in order to earn the right to shoot a buck during hunting seasons, prolonged hunting seasons, check stations. Every effort was made for the absolute right reason. And unfortunately, it wasn't very far into it that the issue of effective communications and compelling communications with stakeholders started to come back. And as I spoke of today, a little bit, obtaining and retaining stakeholder support may be the most difficult issue with regard to CWD, because you have to be able to count on your hunters as your number one tool, even for you, Paul, in Illinois. Yes. Your number one tool for deer population reduction and control is deer hunters. Your sharpshooting is put on top of that. And in Wisconsin, we lost the support of hunters very early on. Alberta did the same thing. I mean, multiple states lost the support of their deer hunters. You lose your deer hunters, and it's not too long after that you lose the support of the people that make decisions and hold purse strings in your legislature. So, unfortunately, in Wisconsin, by I think it was 2007, essentially that toolbox that they'd been, really trying to get every tool out of and use those tools. Other people took that toolbox and dumped it on the floor and said, no, you can't use those anymore. So it's interesting, for what we used to call the core area in Wisconsin, it was about a 400 section area, something like that. And so the first 3 or 4 years of this really aggressive intervention with a little bit of sharpshooting, sharpshooters didn't kill hundreds of thousands of deer, but we increased, with these long seasons and earn a buck and other tools, you could track in that core area that population density on closing day of deer season was in a downward trend. That was the whole idea. We're going to go after the deer because we believe that dramatically reducing the deer population density will result in reducing transmission rate of CWD. And so those first few years, the data points are there. Deer population density was on the decline. But we didn't have the data to be able to really, early on, it's so hard to see what's going on. You have to apply your management interventions for a long period of time before you can hope to measure disease response. So we didn't have the data to measure disease response, but population density was on the decline. Then the tools came out of the box, and I think it was 2007. I could be off by a year, but we went back to more traditional length seasons, 30 days instead of 60 to 100 days, and no earn a buck. And the population rebounded instantaneously because people didn't harvest as many deer that year. So the post-season harvest or population estimate went right back up and proceeded back up. And so, unfortunately, since that point in time, Wisconsin has had a very limited toolbox. Now, they've continued to do a fantastic job of monitoring, looking, for disease, but we have to be clear that monitoring does not change outcomes of disease on the ground. We've got a tremendous data set in Wisconsin, 230,000 samples. It's great for somebody like me to be able to play with, but not a single one of those changed an outcome on the ground.
They went from a very active manipulation of the deer population in those early years to just a very intensive surveillance program. And I think that's one of the points I was trying to get across today and during the talk. It's like when it comes to CWD management of all the different management practices out there as far as what's considered BMPs, they're all very important for reducing risk. But when it comes to affecting a change in your prevalence rates, it's going to take some sort of population manipulation. You're going to have to do something with your herd. All the other things, they'll help you avoid risk, but they're not going to do the work that's going to drive down this disease.
Yeah, that was a great point you made today, Paul. Is there's risk, and then there's affecting the infection rate once you have it. Once you have it, these minor risk issues are still important, but if you don't affect that main driving force, which is the density and the chance of exposing another deer to it, and supplemental feeding and things like that focus animals on a concentrated area and increase disease exposure, that still ties back to density, concentration of animals. If you're not after that, you're not going to impact.
I think that's been demonstrated because there are so many of these management practices that have been implemented as just kind of a routine thing that you do when you get CWD, and certainly they're beneficial and certainly they should be done, but they're not going to do the work of driving down prevalence rates or helping you control it. The disease is much more powerful than that.
So same tools we had for other things. I brought that up today. You go back to Leopold. Mm-hmm. He identified some pretty basic tools: the axe, plow, the gun, and the fire for habitat manipulation. We've used those successfully over many, many years to provide habitat for wildlife. But when it comes down to population management, we're pretty limited. It's called the gun.
Yeah.
And that tool is the same tool that we still have available. Primary tool for affecting change in actual disease on the ground is the gun. Paul's found very creative ways to very liberally apply that tool, and many other jurisdictions have not been as fortunate. And we've seen the outcome. I mean, it's pretty predictable. When disease becomes established, CWD becomes established in a free-ranging deer population, in the absence of aggressive intervention, it's going to spread, it's going to grow, and if it's there long enough, it's going to alter the productivity of that herd.
And that having been said, it all comes back to that, are we winning? No, I couldn't say that we're winning, but we're kind of holding the line, and we feel that we need more management tools. We need things to be developed. We need vaccines. But until then, we're trying to hold the line so that, we have a deer resource that is poised to take advantage of new techniques when it comes out there. And I'll be the first to say that, we've seen fairly widespread population reductions, particularly in our core counties where we've been working so long. And I never thought that as a deer manager that taking deer populations below population goals would be something that I would be looking to do. But that having been said, even though deer populations are lower today than than they were prior to 2002 in Winnebago and Boone and DeKalb County. They're still at a robust level that can accommodate recreational hunting opportunities, and a significant amount of it. And quite frankly, if you look back to the 1980s or even the 1990s, the population levels that we see in most parts of those CWD counties would have been considered to be very good levels back then.
Mm-hmm. It's a different discussion, certainly, but from an ecological perspective, there's very few places that we have the right number of deer. You look at, go back to my home state of Wisconsin, you look at oak regeneration. It's pretty much absent in the face of deer population densities in double digits, or 40 deer per square mile. You look in northeastern Wisconsin, the eastern white cedar has essentially been eliminated by one thing: white-tailed deer. So it's a little different. I grew up in the 60s, and even in west central part of Wisconsin, deer were pretty cool. Pretty cool to see them, and hunters were out there, and that's when when they were successful, they'd hang it up in the tree right next to the road, and not everybody got a deer. But by the late 80s, I remember on opening day, the first few times I was out deer hunting, I'd be thrilled to see some deer. And about 10 years later, I remember counting 160 deer coming past me on opening day. Now, certainly some of those were repeat customers, but still to have that kind of volume. And at the same time, I was just beginning to learn, ecology and plant, community structure and things like that. And it's like, what? We got a browse line coming here. And you look at like probably the majority of white-tailed deer range in North America. You look close enough, there's probably a browse line there.
Mm-hmm. And the good news is, I think, that to take away from this is that while we've been maintaining deer densities at somewhat lower levels in those CWD counties, deer biologists have demonstrated that it's increasing and growing deer herds is something that's easily done. And so should we get additional tools, things that allow us to take care of this insidious disease? So, growing the herd back to socially acceptable levels that are agreed upon, that's one of the easiest things we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just let them reproduce without the disease. Yeah. Paul, I want to kind of circle back to something you said earlier about, and you've been talking about sharpshooting and culling, and that's a process where, in your state at least, your agency staff go out and, with special circumstances, baiting, hunting at night, reduce localized deer populations.
Yes.
And that's a tool. And some states allow private landowners to participate in that. How it happens.
Yes, like Missouri. Yes.
Yeah. It happens differently in some states, but the point I want to emphasize here is you mentioned it's a small number of deer relative to the total number of deer harvested in the CWD management zone. Talk a little bit more about that. It's not like your agency is going out and killing 90% of the deer that are killed in the zone.
No, that's correct. And I think that's probably a common misperception. And that is that the numbers of deer that are being taken by sharpshooters is huge, and that's just not really the case. I mean, we're shooting deer from about 125 sections, give or take, in a more than 7,000 square mile area. So it's like we have prioritized where it is we need to work to have the biggest impact, and certainly we're limited as to what we can cover, and so we take these higher priority areas, and so we're shooting on a very small percentage of the landscape. So 100 and some square miles out of more than 7,000 square miles. And the number of deer that we take in a 2.5 month period will, be about 1,000 in a typical year. That's over 17 counties. And the deer harvest in those counties, they're not our huge harvest counties for the state of Illinois, but nevertheless, some of them do quite well. And so in those counties, the hunter harvest in a typical year would be in the range of 15 to 20,000 deer. And so it's, the hunters do the job first, and then we're trying to do a little fine tuning after the season as far as just a particular spot, and that's it. It's not as if we're talking huge numbers, but the ones that we take, they're important. They're very important just because of the high risk areas that they come from.
We talk about, you mentioned you're not huge numbers. Let's go back across that border once, and I think, it's something I'm not proud of at all. And, the state of Wisconsin this year, we've seen disease move. It's been picked up now in, I think, like 26 counties. And, 4 counties with real high prevalence. And this year, the state of Wisconsin, through voluntary surveillance, picked up, I think it was 1,063 positives from 1 year. It said voluntary surveillance, and in those core 4 counties, less than 1 in 4 of the deer killed by hunters was actually sampled for CWD. So how many were actually killed last year and taken home and eaten?
Yeah,
Whole another story. And how many more are out there on the landscape? Again, if you don't catch it early and intervene.
That's more positives in 1 year than we have found throughout the history of our surveillance in 17 years or more.
So I hope I can articulate this question, and I'll tell you what, Steve, this is going to be my last one because we've got catfish waiting on us. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, I was thinking about when you guys were presenting today and again talking tonight, the conversation among hunters, in that, again, because you're adjacent states, and what's going on, Paul, in your state with hunter harvest and sharpshooting, and acceptance. Is this routine now, for example?
No, I would never throw it into that category. Okay. It's always a point of discussion. It requires constant communication, and so and the players are not always the same, and particularly in political circles as you get newly elected representatives for those areas that that were not there in the beginning, and so it requires you to always be ready to frankly discuss what it is you're doing and what you're trying to do. And I realize that we're not all going to be sitting around holding hands, and we're not always going to be on the same page. But I think if all sides will concede that what is important to us is this deer resource, and that's what we're focusing on, then we can have those frank discussions, and we can disagree on some points, but I think we always need to realize that we all have the same interest in mind. That's we're trying to get to the same place, and I think back to I was telling Bryan last night when we were talking about distribution and how prevalence is so clumped, and you see hot spots, and we've had places in Illinois where we had, as a matter of fact, one of our original clusters, the one in McHenry County, where we found 3 positives the first year, and we found it there in subsequent years. We haven't seen a positive in that area probably for 10 years now. So there are situations where you feel like, hey, we did something there, but I also look at how things could have been, because as we've been working on these local areas, from time to time we'll come up on some real hot spots where it's very worrisome. You take a few deer and you're seeing a lot of positives, and it's a kind of localized effect. But we had an area where we were getting 1 out of 3 deer that were positive, a 33% prevalence rate, but it was a very small confined area, and we were able to deal with it and to remove enough deer from this very prolific hotspot that it went away, and we don't see those sorts of prevalence rates. I haven't seen any in some time, but it leads you to think about what could have been if we weren't doing this. You know, we could see how something could go up to 1 in 3 in a small location, and if we had let that go, you know, how long would it take for that to be a significant area, and to be something which we couldn't have dealt with. So I take a lot of pride in that, knowing, you know, this is not a controlled study where we have our control and we have, you know, and we're able to see, you know, exactly how it would have been. But it's not difficult to imagine what Northern Illinois would look like if we had not been trying to manage this for these many years.
Data is a really powerful thing. And when you have these long-term data sets, even when it's on localized basis, it has to facilitate those conversations you have with landowners and hunters. Look at what we've done, and look what's happened in places where they haven't had the opportunity, or, you know, for whatever set of reasons. So the different outcomes. At least, you know, for me, I've spent, you know, half a career, you know, talking to, you know, many different audiences about CWD. I remember even back in, you know, like 2008, 2009, the data from Wisconsin that, you know, I used back then and I use today. You know, you would tell people that when statistically analyzed, it looks like prevalence is increasing at an exponential rate. And they'd look at you kind of cross-eyed and say, you know, that looks kind of flat to me. I can't really see that. But now, you know, here we are a decade later, and it's undeniable when you look at the exponential growth curves. And you know, we all know as scientists that exponential growth curves look awfully flat in the early years. But once they hit that inflection point, they rise pretty dramatically. And now, unfortunately, in places like Wisconsin and Alberta, in zones in Wyoming and Colorado and West Virginia and Saskatchewan, the data is pretty clear. And so it's a lot easier to talk to audiences about CWD because you can show them. And they go, wow, it really is doing something. And we needed that data in order to make a, you know, compelling arguments that it was doing something. Unfortunately, by the time it's hit that inflection point, your options for, you know, effective management are greatly diminished.
And that's why it's important to jump on the disease early.
Yeah, if you want to sit back and watch it for 5-6 years just to make sure you think you know what's going on is right, you lost a tremendous opportunity. You know, you go back, and this is one of the most prophetic quotes, you know, that I've ever seen. It's Dr. Elizabeth Williams, who, you know, was the first to classify CWD as a member of the TSE family. I'll mangle her quote, but it was in response to CWD being found in a game farm in Saskatchewan, you know, and asked what to do. And it goes something to the effect of, you know, dig wider and deeper than you ever thought necessary. Remove all sources, for you'll get one chance. If disease becomes established in a free-ranging population, you'll likely have it for a very long time.
And Paul, you mentioned, you described the emotional drain on you and your agency staff about fighting this disease, and it's been 17, 18 years you've been doing this. Clearly, it's not something that you ever wanted to do, and yet, back to what you hear on the internet, there are some people that argue, well, these state agencies are bringing it in just because they want to create something to stimulate new funding, or, you know, the researchers want some funding. I mean, I don't know any biologist that has ever wanted anything to do with chronic wasting disease if they didn't already have it.
Well, it's such a huge drain on our resources. It's like you think of all the, you know, it's the number one activity that all our biologists must participate in. and this is not a voluntary thing. It's like, you send them off to the front. It's your shift, it's your turn to do this. And if you look at, we keep programmatic accounting each year for federal aid reimbursement, and so everybody's having to record their activities and what they were participating in. And if you look at the number one thing that all our staff have to work on, it's chronic wasting disease related. And we're detailing them off to work for weeks at a time over the winter, and that's just the management part. It doesn't include all their activities associated with surveillance and working with our cooperators for meat lockers and all that sort of stuff is for the surveillance end of it. And so you think back to before 2002 and think of all the other activities that we could have been doing to promote wildlife on the landscape, and the things that were habitat related and all these things that are being impinged on by chronic wasting disease. It's not something that anybody wants.
I know we're running out of time. I want to kind of make one last stab at something I think
Sure.
is important here. Is consistently I heard today in the presentations that hunters are still and will continue to be the main most effective tool in dealing with chronic wasting disease. Do you agree with that? And I think I want to just emphasize the importance of everybody that's listening to our podcast, and I think most of them are hunters, landowners.
Mm-hmm.
They need to help their state wildlife agencies and don't be the person that tries to stop a management activity that, Bryan, you've shown, stated over and over these different examples where controlling the disease or not controlling it is critical to the future of the resource. And I don't know, I'm trying to be concise here, but I'm rambling because it's so emotional. None of us want.
I agree, and if you look at it, it's like, for any way you care to look at it, the hunters are the most important tool that we have. Whether it's the surveillance aspect and all the myriad of samples that they provide to us, and the location data, and everything that they provide on the surveillance end, that's critical in itself. But if you look, deer management is all about establishing goals and controlling populations at acceptable levels and that sort of thing. And 1,000 deer that we take as sharpshooters during the year, that's chump change. That's a fine tuning of what's being accomplished by the hunters in the 15 to 20,000 deer that they're taking in that area. That's where the work is. We're just we're trying to fine tune the CWD aspects of it and get the bang for our bucks that sharpshooting can provide by just trying to get those positives off the surface of the ground. It's like the rest of it they're doing. And
you're doing the surgical removal after the season to fine tune what they weren't able to do.
Yeah, and it's all based on the information that they gave us. It's like if we could direct efforts so easily just by a hunting program into saying, okay, we only need the deer taken here, but unfortunately a landowner's not going to say, oh, okay, everybody can come get on my property, When I put agency personnel on a property, those landowners have our assurances that this individual is responsible. It's his livelihood, for crying out loud. He has to be responsible, and that we're only going to do this, and we're going to do it this way, and we know where everything is, and if need be, we've had places where it's like you have a 5 foot wide shot that you are going to take, and that is the only one that you are ever going to take. That deer has to be right there, or else
You don't shoot.
they walk.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have that level of control, and that you can't get by just by just having wide open hunting to help you do it. But you know, I view this is just an enhancement. It's helping us to be much more precise, but they're doing the heavy lifting.
Right.
And you do have landowner approval. You don't just go out and shoot on somebody's land.
Always, yes.
Yeah.
So I'll take a little bit different tact on that. So I appreciate that hunters are the number one, they're the resource manager. Obviously, they're what keep deer populations in check. But hunters, by and large, hunt recreationally. They go hunting because they want to hunt. At least in the early years, in multiple states, I think in the human dimensions research would bear this out. Hunters don't want to be disease managers. And there's a big difference in the motive for going out there. Paul and his sharpshooting teams are disease managers. They're trying to surgically affect change in disease dynamics. And it's very hard to compel recreational hunters to do those things because we're going to have to ask them to take additional deer. We're likely going to, at least in some zones, ask them to reduce deer population densities below those socially and recreationally desirable levels. And so those are up in opposition to the things and the reasons why people go hunting. They want to go hunting to spend time with their family and friends, to feel good, to go out and procure meat. They don't want to go out to shoot extra deer. They don't want to. Each hunter has a personal consumption quota.
Well, it's not in their best interest to take home a positive, for crying out loud.
Yeah. So you're trying to get hunters to do things that are opposed to the very reason, the core reason that they want to hunt. And it's a conundrum. It's a big challenge. And you want to go deeper, it goes against the grain of the North American model of wildlife conservation. And so we heard a little bit today, but it's a thing that I like to discuss quite frequently, that the North American model was not built with something as significant as a disease threatening. And so we're turning that model upside down, and it just wasn't built with something like this in mind. It's a real challenge.
That is a tough thing to, particularly if you have some success at lowering populations. It's like, where do hunters want to hunt? Well, they want to hunt where they're going to be able to be successful, to see animals. And our staff have to go out whether they want to or not, whether there's a lot of sign out there or not. If they're in a critically important area, even with low numbers of deer, they're going to be out there again and again because we need to take more deer there. And that kind of goes against the whole grain of hunting. It's like, I'm going to go to this spot where I know there's virtually no chance of me seeing something, and so those sorts of issues are tough when it comes to using hunters in areas where they're going to be fairly significant impacts, or where there need to be fairly significant impacts.
But one of the regular things that you hear, Wisconsin heard, other states, Alberta heard, heard it as well. Well, hold on. If you want deer shot, why are you hiring sharpshooters? Why are you going out? Why don't you just come to us, the hunters? We'll take care of it. But time and time, data proves, that they're not willing to go to the level of to undertake that task to the degree that government sharpshooters are able to do.
Well, like Paul said, speaking to your point, it goes from recreation to work, to really hard work, to dreadful work in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of data historically from agencies that have sampled, surveyed their hunters about how many deer did you harvest. In Mississippi, the successful deer hunter shoots 1.4 deer. I heard you, Bryan, earlier, 1.5 deer. The typical hunter is not going to shoot more than 2 deer.
Yeah. Well, that comes from experience in Texas when started out, I think when I was there with I think it was a 3 deer bag limit, and hunters shot 1.5 deer per hunter. And so when Parks and Wildlife proposed adding another deer, going to a 4 deer statewide bag limit, I mean, people came unglued. The world was going to end as we knew it. And so the commission enacted that, and hunters took exactly 1.5 deer per year. So we added another one.
Yeah.
Added it to 5. Went through it all again. The whole world was going to end. And the data showed that, we didn't move harvest one bit. Hunters took a deer and a half per year.
You change the bag limit, you can lengthen the season. I mean, hunters are only going to kill as many deer.
It's a personal
you can
consumption
you can do
limit,
all those things. You just can't make them hunt. and so, it's which is one reason why the relationship between a hunter and an agency has to be a cooperative one, because it's like human nature comes in, and it's like, well, we would like to see more, or we would like to see less, but it's kind of a cooperative agreement that hunters are going to have to buy into what we're trying to do in order to help us. That's simply the bottom line.
And they have to trust the wildlife agency. You're not trying to harm the deer resource or their use of it. You're just trying to fix a problem that's really critical. And you mentioned earlier about, someone asked you about what's the exit strategy, and you said you didn't have one. And the reason you don't have one in this kind of a disease situation is there's 25 states, 24 states that have had free-ranging CWD deer. And only one of those states ever got out of the we have free-ranging CWD deer. So it's not something you can expect to have an exit strategy. Once you have it, you're living with it, and it's not easy for the agency. And hunters, you might get frustrated because the agency's doing this or asking you to do that, but it's a team approach. The biologists are passionate about their deer conservation and management because they love the deer just as much as the hunters do, and it needs to be a team approach to fight. And I like the terminology y'all used. Insidious disease that chronic wasting disease is.
I think a lot of that kicks in with the WAF, with the Western Association, has put out the adaptive guidelines, and these are states and provinces been dealing with CWD longer than we've been able to pronounce it. And but they've realized that responsible agencies owe it to the resource that there's a chance of irreparable harm coming from this disease, and they have to do something about it to try and get it at least under control. Nobody's of the opinion or the fairy tale that they're going to eliminate CWD from the western states, but they have agreed that they have to find ways to keep it from decimating that resource. That's what we're in this for. I mean, Paul said he never dreamed he'd be doing the things he was doing. I never dreamed I'd be doing the things I'm doing, but it's for that same reason. We're wildlife biologists at the core, and we love what we do. It's all about the resource.
Well, I want to thank both of you guys. Number one, for all you do and have been doing for 20 plus years. I know you talk about this all the time. I'm sure you get tired of talking about CWD sometimes, so we appreciate you coming to Mississippi and helping us with this roundtable. I know I learned a lot today. We had about 100 people in the audience, and I know I've been hearing all the chatter, so they have really enjoyed your presentations. Thank you for sacrificing your time. Thank you for sacrificing a little bit more this evening and helping us record this podcast. So
glad to help.
Just really appreciate what you guys do.
I think you mentioned catfish.
We did. Deep fried in peanut oil.
You think there's any left?
I hope there's at least 4 plates left. Yeah. There better be.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bryan. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
On behalf of the MSU Deer Lab, we'll say let's go get something to eat. We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.